So thank you very much. My name is Jamie Clarke. I'm the Executive Director of Climate Outreach, formerly known as COIN. For those of you who've known us for a while, we have slightly refreshed our brand to be a little bit more positive and focused on the future. I hope you appreciate that for what it is. What is this organisation? What do we do? Well, we're passionate about the need to tackle climate change. And our specialism is widening engagement with the issue. We take social research, we understand what it is that people relate to and how that relates to climate change, and provide tools and advice and expertise for those of you out there who would like to widen those engagements, organisations, statutory bodies, including governments, trying to help widen this issue. We think unless we get the majority of society behind the issue and agreeing that there is a problem, we're never going to have the sustained solutions that we all know we need. And we're at 2 weeks away from a very big and important event, the UN Climate Conference in Paris, that most of you are probably quite familiar with. And when I looked ahead a couple of years ago, I realised there was an important element that was looking like we were going to get missed out on. And indeed, that seems to be the case. So tonight we're going to be talking about the only UK social research about public attitudes to climate change. There's a lot of talk about it, but it doesn't tend to be with the public. So you're going to hear a little bit more about that afterwards. So the format of this evening, first of all, we're going to hear from our host, Professor Chris Rapley, who's kindly given us the venue. And he is quite well known to a lot of people, but he's the Professor of Climate Science here at UCL. Previously, he's been the Director of the Science Museum, and before that, the British Antarctic Survey. He wrote and delivered his play last year, 2071, which I imagine some people are aware of and went to, which was great, and is really focused on science communication. So we'll hear from Chris, then we'll pass on to our senior researcher, Chris Shaw. He's previously worked at Oxford University's ECI, the Environmental Change Institute, and he specialises in climate policy, and recently authored and published a book called 2 Degrees, Dangerous Limits, Public Understanding and Decision Making. And you can pick that up from your local W.H. Smiths after this. Possibly not. And then we will hear from our panel. We've got a great panel lined up this evening. And that panel will be chaired by our founder, George Marshall, who's sitting over here. George is probably well known to many of you. He founded the organisation and is our Director of Projects. He's an author and recently wrote Don't Even Think About It, Why Our Brains Are Programmed to Ignore Climate Change. He's a great orator, and we're very lucky to have pulled him to London from Bristol, where he spent the last 2 nights headlining climate change discussions. And before we kick off, though, I'd like to say a big thank you to the University of Cardiff and the University of Bristol for sponsoring our research. Excellent. So over to Chris. Chris number 1.
Thanks very much indeed, Jamie. So it's just my job to welcome you all here this evening on behalf of UCL. Climate Outreach asked if we could help them find a venue in London, so I jumped at the opportunity because I have a particular interest in this subject. You've heard that I'm a Professor of Climate Science. I've been studying climate science one way or other, either from satellites or more directly for many, many years. But in the last few years, I've got really interested in the discussion, the discussion in the public square of this, what has turned out to be unexpectedly controversial subject. And so I've been working with neuroscientists and psychosociologists and narrative specialists and others to try and understand what exactly is going on. Much more complicated to tell a story that has strong emotional responses or ideological responses than it is a piece of science which is otherwise more emotionally or ideologically neutral. So this particular study, I think, is really rather important. As you've just heard, we're heading in, two and a half weeks' time to the Conference of the Parties. To some extent, the Conference of the Parties has already acted as a vehicle and done its job. We have these international commitments that cover about 90% of global carbon emissions. If they are fulfilled, and that's of course a big if, but if they are fulfilled, they'll pull us down from a projected 4 to 5 degrees of warming at the end of the century down to about just under 3. The nations of the world have decided that 2 is the guardrail we should be heading for. Some people believe it should be less than that. But there's a general feeling that this is a good start. I agree with the comment made by Jamie that there's only so far that the political class can push things. It's interesting that business are taking a great interest in this subject and moving rather rapidly. Somebody from business the other day said, you know, the tide has turned and you can choose whether, you know, which way you swim, upstream or downstream, but just recognise that the tide has turned. But in the end, public support, public interest are absolutely crucial to achieving the goals that many of us believe we should achieve. So, with no more, I would just like to say before it gets forgotten that the person who actually organised this event is Jen Hazelton, who's recently been appointed as the coordinator of the environment domain in UCL. She put a lot of work into this, so I'd just like a little round of applause for Jen. And with that, over to Chris. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, thanks very much, Professor Rapley. Thanks, Jen, for organising. And thank you all for coming out this evening. It's a great privilege to be able to share the results of our research with you. So there we are. All eyes will be on Paris at the end of the year. So says the UK government. Public awaits with bated breath to hear what will emerge from the conference. Reminds you a bit of the disaster movies where the asteroid is coming to Earth with a comet, and you have the scenes of the peoples crowded around the TVs and the diners and the restaurants and the bars, the city streets, abandoned cars, all is quiet by a wake announcement from the world leaders to save us from this impending catastrophe. Now, obviously, perhaps in a carbon bubble that many of us live in, carbon policy bubble, carbon communications bubble, this might seem a reasonable assumption. A claim that we see quite frequently, and certainly in Copenhagen 2009 again, and my book was looking at this, a farmer was riding to the rescue, and we have 24 hours to save the earth. So this kind of narrative, this iconography, continues. So is it true? Are all eyes on Paris? We wanted to get a snapshot of UK public opinion on this and find out what the UK public think of these talks. I think most of us will recognise the importance of what's at stake. So do the public understand this? And it seems very important that it be the UK public, because the UK has been at the forefront of climate change policy, the UK Climate Change Act, which was and is the only binding unilateral agreement to limit emissions, the goal to limit emissions by 80% by 2050, so the UK can fulfil its responsibility, do its bit towards its overall global goal of 2 degrees centigrade. So it seems good reason to see whether the UK government is correct to assume that all eyes will be on Paris. So firstly, what I want to do is just tell you a bit about how we went about finding out about what the UK public think. So climate outreach, what we are trying to do is try and engage on the basis of values, talk with people, work with people, and talk with people and start on the basis of what matters to people, what's the world they want to see, what values they admire in other people. Those are the sort of core of our methodology that we want to work with, rather than trying to shock people into action through graphs and numbers, etc. So we carried out 3 workshops in September of this year, one in Cardiff, one in Bristol, one in Edinburgh. And these take up a significant amount of people's time. They run for 2.5 hours each workshop. I have 11 participants at each workshop, and these participants are selected to be broadly representative in terms of age, political views, income, and a range of other sort of standard demographic. variables. This photograph is not from one of the workshops we conducted for this research, it's from another piece of research, but it's that sort of scenario, just sitting down, we're talking with people, and want to start from where people are at, rather than trying to start from the science, trying to start from this sort of global discourse of 2 degrees, etc. And I get this, a number of stages. So firstly, we sit down, we talk, what matters to you? What are the sort of values you admire in people? What's a good person to you? And then we sort of build from there. Do you see those sorts of values around you? Do you see, are these sort of values that people generally have? What do you think is happening? Is the world getting more like this, less like this? Just try and build a conversation starting from people's experience, people's values. I mean, we all have those values, we all have experience. These are common human traits. So there's nothing, you don't have to be an expert, you don't have to be have a PhD or anything like that to be able to engage in these conversations. We all have ideas about what we want the world to be like, and those are all equally valid. That's the assumptions we begin with. Everyone's assumption, desire, views deserve to be heard. And then with this, once we have that conversation, then move on to sort of unprompted views about climate change. So when you hear the word climate change, when you hear the word global warming, what comes to mind? What images come to mind? What words come to mind? What feelings come to mind? So again, you don't need any expertise for to do this. This comes directly from people's own experience, their own values, their own hopes and fears. And then we follow with that up. In this instance, we have just a 2 or 3 minute tutorial about what the UN climate talks about, what this 2 degree limit is about. Some of you may know about the burning embers diagram, which is being used. And it just tries to show where the dangers, where the risks are at various levels of warming, and it tries to communicate in a graphic form the uncertainties around it, so that arrows get increasingly red as the temperatures go up, as the risks increase, and those are associated with various forms of impacts. There might be ecosystem impacts, it might be social system impacts with agriculture, etc. So we just have a 2 or 3 minute, we'd love to avoid ever having to use a graph in climate communications, but in this scenario, it was just relevant and useful just to frame what the talks were trying to do, what it was they were trying to avoid, what the objective of the talks were. Then we'd have a break, and then we'd come back, and we'd talk about these 4 statements. We had 4 statements, they're just like a paragraph really, and they are meant to articulate, encapsulate 4 separate positions that if you were to pick up the newspaper, look at the relevant websites, engage with this conversation, you might encounter. So the first one is, I guess, would be the standard sort of liberal discourse you might encounter in the Guardian, that these talks, governments coming together through these talks, trying to reach agreement, are the only way that this problem will be resolved. So that's one statement. The second one, a bit more of a sort of right-wing one, saying, well, look, actually government's the problem, too much regulation is the problem. It's going to increase taxes, it's going to hamper economic growth. Look what's happening at the price of renewables. Those are dropping, energy efficiency has increased dramatically. Get off the backs of business, let them innovate, and that will deliver the emission cuts that are required. The third statement is saying, look, you can't trust business, you can't trust governments, this is about the people have got to come together and do this. So this is sort of the NGO, the campaign type scenario. For example, at 350.org and their divestment campaigns, they're trying to get say, students at universities to ensure that the institution divests its money out of fossil fuel extraction industry. So it's that sort of approach, saying actually it's us that people have come together and do this. And then the fourth really sort of speaks to this sort of climate justice theme that is very prominent in the climate negotiation talks. You may be sort of familiar with this idea. It's really saying that you can't just fix climate change without actually fixing the sort of social inequalities that underlie this, the drive to increase fossil fuel emissions. You have to address the past and how, for example, Western nations have reaped the benefit of industrialisation, have used up their carbon budgets. That unless you address this inherent injustice, it's these poor nations who are most at risk from climate change impacts. Unless you address that, then you can't do anything about climate change. So those were the 4 statements that we just asked people to go through one by one. What do you think of those statements? Hear from people, hear how they react. So that was the process we employed, and so what did we find out? Well, firstly, when we did the unprompted views on climate change, what we found was a sort of sense of resignation, a sense of fear, genuine concern. People see what's happening around them, see it on the news. I sat at home yesterday, I live on the South Coast, I had the window open and a T-shirt, working at the computer all day. I mean, you know, it's getting increasingly difficult to deny changes that are happening around us. And this is very much what we saw in these three groups. Sense of being, of resignation, you know, that I'm worried about what I see happening around me. What can I do? I've been told to change my light bulbs. Well, I know that's not going to do anything. This is a cataclysmic event, I'm told. Catastrophe, imminent end of the world. Do you expect me to solve it by changing light bulbs? Come on. But I can't go out and build a wind farm on my own. So what am I to do? You know, day after day I turn on the TV, there's another problem, another crisis that I can't do anything about, but apparently is going to wreck my life. And so we saw this time and time again. It's just, yeah, tell me something new. What can I do about it? People are worried, but you get this sense of, well, people don't care, or there's apathy, there's, you know, scepticism. People just don't know what to do. But they're hearing the messages of doom and gloom all the time. I saw genuine concern when I was running these workshops. So then we asked them, you know, have you heard about Paris talks? Have you heard about these conferences coming up? And there's very low awareness of the conferences. 2 or 3 people had heard something vaguely about it. Didn't know really what it was about. Didn't know why it affected them. What was separate, what was different, what's special about this conference? So I think we have to, you know, first finding I would say is there's been a failure of communication. We know how important these talks are. There's a sense that the whole world is watching, but it's not. So something's going on with the way that we're communicating about climate change. But, and this is the thing, so it's time and time again, when you start talking about these conferences, when you start saying, well, look, your representatives, you as citizens of democratic societies, your representatives are coming together in these meetings, trying to do something about it. When we've gone through this brief tutorial about the risks that have been at stake and what these talks are trying to avert, then we start to see people start sitting up, eyes light up. People say, tell me more, what's happening here? What's this about? How have I not heard about this? I want to hear more. All of a sudden we start to see people engaging with this process, this, you know, this sitting back in the chair, although they walked before, starts, you know, people start to lean forward in the chair and they start to engage with the process. And I'm going to talk about that. I just want to give an example just at the end of this sort of short presentation. So I'm going to come back to this. But there is something about that process when people sit down and talk with their peers, something different starts to happen. They want to know more. And then if you have these 4 statements and these 3 sentences, one about governance, one about business, one about people. Well, when we actually asked people to respond to them, it wasn't that they were saying, well, actually, I think it's one or the other. What people were telling us is actually they felt that there needed to be a partnership between the three social actors, if you will. So there was no trust in politicians, not surprising. No real trust in business. This was pre the Volkswagen scandals. But it wasn't that saying, you know, they didn't say, but the people are saints, all these others are sinners. They recognised that, you know, that we'd have a green government, people really care passionately. But nonetheless, there was just this core belief, feeling, understanding that only governments can do this. This is a huge problem. Only governments have the power to organise, to set laws, to deliver this. They can't be trusted to do it on their own. There needs to be a partnership with the public involved, providing some sort of you know, that the public represent the public interest. And that's what government should be acting on. They're concerned that actually that they're being co-opted, captured by the private interest of business. Not saying there's no role for business in it, but that governments need to regulate this and need to know they're being watched, need to know that actually their primary goal in the face of this problem is to represent the general public long-term interest, not the short-term interest that the politicians may have, or the profit interest of business, that somehow there needs to be a partnership between these actors, these separate groups in this process. And so they wanted, they said, okay, well, what can we do to make sure this happens? How can we make sure that governments are acting properly? We can see that it has to be governed. How can this happen? What do we need in order to be able to be partners in this process? And this is what they told us. The first thing they wanted was, they want consistent and trustworthy information. I think if you look at the research, people do struggle with the uncertainties around climate science, which is not about whether our actions are driving the climate, but what impacts will occur when and who will be affected most severely by it. It was more about, one quote was, well, when I turn on the TV, one expert comes on to one thing, then another expert comes on to another thing. And then that's the end of the news report. I don't know who to believe. So it's almost like they're looking for some tools, information they can rely on, that will help them navigate, with their own values, interpret what's happening, be able to take a position, be able to respond with some sort of confidence to what they're hearing and seeing out there, to be useful partners in this process. Also, there's just a lack of belief in the technical feasibility of this. Talk about carbon in parts per million. Well, how are you going to measure where that carbon's coming from? Factories all over the world, I don't believe that you have the ability to actually monitor effectively where the carbon is coming from and thus effectively limit it. And I think the UK audience, I heard this a couple of times, just a sense that we've sort of been stung by the IT failures we've seen with the NHS and sort of the tax system. So there's just this general sense that actually, can you do this? Have you got the tools? Have we got the technology to know where carbon is coming from and limit it to 400 or 350, whatever it might be? The other thing is that people, when we talk about these agreements, it's just that people are naive. How do you believe that they're going to agree anything? Even if they do agree what to do, who's going to police it? Who tells the superpowers what to do? So there's a real sense they want this process to work. People do want it to work. The questions are, tell me the answer, how do we address these very deep concerns about the process? So it's all very well to get an agreement. How will that agreement be structured? Who will police this agreement? There's a sense that we want to believe in this, but we've got some real concerns about how it's being structured. And then the other thing, the statement about fairness, climate justice, that was the statement that people responded to most positively. That's the statement that received the nods of assent. Yes, okay, yeah, this is what's going to happen. Now, actually, issues of climate justice, fairness are very complicated, and I think we could happily run 2.5-hour workshops just looking at this issue. And I think fairness, justice means different things to different people. But in some sort of instinctive sense, there was like, well, whatever happens, it's got to be fair. Whatever that means, fair to whom, where and when. It takes a lot of unpacking. But that's an important principle to be communicating. So what next? As I've sort of alluded to, I think we're moving into a world, a time now where mitigation and impacts and adaptation are going to be intensified. The need to mitigate any sort of anywhere near 2 degrees is to be achieved. The need to adapt to the impacts already built into the system. That's just going to grow in intensity, urgency. I think the term I've used, I think to some extent, in the research I've done around this about policy communication at 2 degrees, there's been a sense of not in front of the children type sentiment. Public opinion, it's a bit of a hornet's nest really. They don't want to be sticking anything in there aggravating public opinion. We're going to try and do this without involving the public if we can. So we're here to talk about, I guess, nuclear power, CCS, these big things that will reduce emissions without having to get people on board and change their behaviour. But what I saw in these workshops when we tried to move towards this deeper relationship, deeper dialogue with people, was a real profound desire for someone to happen to be part of that process. People don't trust anyone else to do it. But there is an apathy, per se, about climate change. There's resignation, there's despair, very deep concern. I think in the past year, inevitably, we relied on the broadcast media to try and get the message across, because you reach lots of people with it, and the online world. But what I saw in these workshops is, let's fail, it's war that comes back to most people. News broadcasts about the talks, whatever. Indifferent. It just gets lost in the noise of everything else that's going on. There's no real deep engagement, understanding of those processes and what it might deliver, what's at stake, what's been tried to be avoided. People are, people are atomised in life. The sense that, well, if I worry about it, well, people just think I'm strange. I don't hear anyone else talking about it. No one talks about climate change at work. Let's forget it. Just people think I'm a weirdo. But I think that silence, that disengagement is socially constructed. When people come together in these workshops and they have the chance to talk about fears, all of a sudden people become very engaged, very concerned, and want to be part of this. So I think what these workshops have shown is this disengagement is socially constructed. It's not inevitable and it can change. And I'm just going to finish now with one case study to come back to this. I do think I saw these workshops are transformative. In Cardiff, there was a person there. This person was in their mid-60s, had breathing difficulties, mobility issues, walking stick. It was quiet throughout the talk. Discussion, nothing to say. And as we got towards the end, they piped up and spoke with great passion, but very clearly. And said this, I think it's the people who can force the governments. I definitely think that. So at these conferences, there should be more outside people than government there to throw their arguments at the government. Now, of course, there will be lots of people at Paris. And I think if there had been a train leaving Cardiff that evening to Paris, this person would have got on there, would have been at the doors of the conference hall with their stick, banging on the door to be let in, and to tell them to get on with it and get an agreement resolved. It would cost them their life. This process, this ability to talk with their peers and not be made to feel crazy about it, seemed to be very transformative for people. Paris is not full stop. It's just one step in this process of increasingly urgent, increasingly visible, increasingly apparent need to mitigate and adapt and cope with climate change. What we've shown here is I think that public opinion is an untapped potential, an untapped resource in this process. I think that we need to be doing more of this, bringing people on board, because this story doesn't end at the end of December. Okay, thanks very much.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Anybody who has attended kind events before knows that we want you to participate very strongly in the discussion. The starting point for that is for you to have a chance to think of what you've heard and your own ideas with the people around you. So what we'd like, please, is if you could talk to the person next to you, doesn't have to be pairs and greet them or whatever works for you. And I think maybe as a starting point, just explore this issue of how do we increase public engagement around Paris? Is communications the problem? We believe that it is. Do you? And how could we improve those communications? I guess also, if we want to explore it, do we really even need public participation in the international process, or would we like to have their participation somewhere else? How important as a priority for public engagement is public participation in Paris? So, a key question then, how can we get better at this? Just look at the person next to you, just for a few minutes. And then what we'll do is we'll start to hear from the panel, and then we'd like to hear your views as well. All right, everybody, thank you very much indeed. And we'll now go back into... Is my mum asking something? Yes. Thank you so much. It's getting also fired up. And I hope we're going to be hearing a lot from you. We're going to handle the final part of this with the panel, who I will now reintroduce, somewhat expanded, and I'll explain that to you, and also from you. And I'm going to ask, please, for all of the contributors, both the panel and also members of the audience, to please keep your comments fairly concise so that we can try and cover as much ground as possible with your permission, and also I hope with the panel I may say, okay, fine, let's move on, so that we can cover a lot of ground. I know already a number of you here in the room, we've got a lot of people here in this room who would themselves be experts and specialists in the subject we're working on. So although it's a lecture this, so it feels like vis-a-vis experts and you're a student, but it's not that way at all. I know there's a lot of people in the room who have a great deal to say. I'd like to introduce, we have on the panel, in addition to Chris and Chris, what are we going to call you, Prof Chris and Doc Chris? We have Ruth Davis here. Thank you very much for coming, Ruth. Ruth works for the sustainability consultants E3G, previously held senior climate change positions in Greenpeace, Royal Society for Protection of Birds. And you, Ruth, are a leading expert within the UK on the UN climate negotiations, so we're hoping that we can hear from you about the history of the negotiations. I'm told that you know everything that there is on the subject. Everything there is to know on the subject. And I see you have an MBE, I didn't know that. Well done. For services to the environment, that's good. I should stress that it wasn't services to, to cooking or to bakery or patisserie or.
This is John proving a not very short intervention. Candice, Dr. Candice Howarth, thank you, is a leading national specialist on climate communications, currently working in the International Climate Change Directorate of DEC, Department of Energy and Climate Change, on secondment there, leading specifically on the very subject we're talking about. So it's great to have you here, which is stakeholder engagement and climate communication. So you are absolutely the person to have here on the panel, and Candice has a daunting number of qualifications in meteorology and climate change, and a PhD in climate communication. So the perfect person to have here. Currently working as a senior research fellow at the Global Sustainability Institute at Anglia Ruskin University. Thank you very much for coming. And Chris and Chris, you've heard of all. So can I go for a panel, please? I would very much like to hear from you. Maybe actually we could start with you, Ruth. This question of public engagement. How do we get people more involved in the process? And how important do you think, from your experience of working in the process, is it that we have more public participation?
I think we might use this one up, Rosie. That seems to give up to go. So apologies for the shenanigans of passing my person.
I'm going to perching on top of this chair, but that'll be fine. I'm going to, I guess, answer the question in two parts. I think more public engagement in the transition towards a low-carbon economy and in thinking about the impacts of climate change, absolutely essential. How important is it that people get involved in the process? The process is dreadful, right? It's dire, it's boring, it's complicated, it's technical, it's often very cynical. And I have known many very kind of engaged, enthusiastic and idealistic people end up quite broken by their engagement with it and have gone off to do things that they found more constructive and useful in the climate world. Which is not to mean that I don't think that those talks are absolutely essential, because I think a level of international cooperation in how we address the problem is essential. I just think that on the whole, if I were going to focus my efforts around public engagement, I would not necessarily focus them around public engagement in Paris. I'd focus them around building a really solid, socially just case for a transition. And I'd probably do that more with local authorities and cities than I would necessarily in the UN.
Candice, let me go to you. Sort of, being inside the government, how important would you say that public engagement is from what you can see within the government, and how much do you think that could come to influence the government priorities, for example, gives the climate change?
Yes, certainly. So just to clarify, I'm no longer at the Department of Energy and Climate Change. I was there until a year ago. But I completely agree with what Ruth just said. And from my my experience in government, and whilst the public do play a very important role in helping drive the momentum for action on climate change, I think what is needed to engage with them, for them to engage more in the process, is for them maybe to understand more about the complexities of the negotiation process. As Ruth has just said, it is incredibly complicated, but I know Cornelius have done a lot of work, Climate Outreach have done a lot of work around the use of stories and narratives. And some of the stories I've heard when I was in government from the lead negotiators coming back from these negotiation sessions have been really eye-opening, and stories that I'd never even dreamt of. And it just made me feel like I understood the process a little bit more. Because reading about it in the media or talking to people about it in the media is very different from talking to people who actually live through those negotiations on a day-to-day basis when they go out in Bonn or they'll go out in Paris. So in terms of increasing that engagement with the public, as Ruth said, I don't think they necessarily need to play a role in the negotiations or in Paris itself, but I think they do deserve to understand more what these negotiations entail, and I think government could maybe do a little bit better at just explaining or communicating the story.
Thank you. Chris, I think that what I took from your research was the impression actually nonetheless that when people started to hear more about the process, but they actually did become interested in what to be involved. Is that fair?
Absolutely. Again, I saw a transformative process for the participants. As I say, I think the science is clear, experience is clear, as we move into a world of climate change, of adaptations, of social change. It's a society-wide process increasingly. I think efforts to try and, as I say, to do this not in front of the children behind closed doors. So it's like the trauma of seeing the climate change around you, but no one talk about it. Parents getting divorced, but never talking to you about it. This can't happen in a silence. So I recognise those processes are complex, involve a lot of people, but I think that there's some need for I just find it incredible that there's virtually no awareness of this sort of what it is, the dangers we're trying to avoid. But there just seems no awareness of it. So where do you begin with that social engagement if you don't know what it is that's at stake? Whether that means that we have 7 billion people sat around a huge table negotiating, I'm not proposing that, but somehow there's this huge lacuna, this gap in public understanding, and I don't know how, even on a normative basis, surely people have got the right to understand why the world is changing around in the way it is and what's at stake and what can be done about it. I think there's many reasons why somehow that gap in understanding has to be overcome.
We as an organisation, Climate Outreach, started looking in detail. We wrote a report on this subject of climate silence. So just to mention that, and it sounds from what you're saying that this is an extension about the same problem, that there is a publicly created, not just in the media but in general conversations, so this what you describe as lacuna, this lack of conversation, and this seems to fall into it. Chris, what are your views on this?
Well, first of all, I've been working with Candice on the idea of co-production. There are so many facets of the modern world where it's so much better if you engage people in the discussion so that it's not a paternalistic, we know better than you, because that leads to failure. And I'll come back to that and give some examples in a minute. But about 5 years ago, maybe a bit more, Al Gore came over after he had produced The Inconvenient Truth about the time that the video came out. And he ran a number of workshops in Cambridge where he engaged with kind of senior business leaders and others to try and explain to them what the situation was and get them on board. And talking to him, I asked the question, how can we get this engagement to the level where we can hold those constructive dialogues, even with people who disagree, can we find areas where we do agree, even though we might continue to disagree in some areas, nevertheless, what do we do next? And his solution was shoe leather. He said shoe leather. He said the only way you can do this is to simply get out there and talk to people. One, face to face. People are very good at making a judgment of whether they trust you, whether they believe that what you're saying is right, whether they associate with your values, and whether they have the opportunity to engage. It was sort of what you're finding with your workshops, really. If you just talk to people and break the ice, create a safe space where they're not embarrassed to reveal what they don't know, the hazy understanding that they have, then you can begin to make some progress. And so Al Gore's method, as you may know, is like a Ponzi scheme. That is, he trains people who then go off and train other people. It's like a missionary exercise. But the question that you have to ask is, well, who's responsible for this? The climate science community doesn't really feel this it's its role. The climate science community has a hard enough job trying to understand how the planet works and figure out what trajectory it's on. And although they do some public lectures and feel that that's an obligation, given that their work is paid for by the public, they don't see it as their role to go out and advocate. In fact, they rail against advocating because they feel that undermines their independence and impartiality. So whose job is it to do this? We know that the media want to sell newspapers. They constantly look for particular types of story, which in this case proved to be rather unhelpful. The politicians have their own short-lived and short-term views about this. And so the question really is, who is responsible for this? How do we go about doing it? I'll just give you a couple of examples of where not doing this has proved to be very damaging. There is a power station that was beautifully designed by the engineers and the civil authorities in Rotterdam, which is equipped with carbon capture and storage. But nobody discussed this with the citizens of Rotterdam until they built it. And they then announced brightly, oh, by the way, we're going to pump carbon dioxide underneath you, which actually is a perfectly fine thing to do. The geologists are very happy with this. But the people of Rotterdam said, no, you're not. Where are you going? We don't want to be pumped up with carbon dioxide underneath us. And so that CCS, as far as I know, has not yet been turned on because people weren't kept involved in the process and reacted against it. Nobody trusts anybody these days, so their natural reaction is to be cautious. And there's a similar story from Stockholm, where I used to live, where the freshwater lake Mälaren floods down into the archipelago, and the concrete system that has locks in it and regulates that flow needs to be replaced. A beautiful scheme has been designed. It was about to be implemented, and again, the citizens of Stockholm rather loved the existing structures. Nobody had discussed it with them, and so there's now a very strong movement against that project going ahead, and it's stalled with hands-off our Swiss and hands-off our facilities. So even on relatively innocuous schemes, if you don't get people with you, then you'll run into trouble. So it seems to me this is crucial. I know that the negotiators who go to Paris and have been to previous conferences of the parties want to feel that they have public support behind them. It strengthens their negotiating position. And so the lack of that public support is very damaging.
Thank you. I'd like to open it up to members of the floor now, please. Yes. I don't know if we're going to be able to run the mic up, so if you could speak very loudly and introduce yourself as well if you want to say something.
Good evening. Trevor Hutchings from WWF, the Global Conservation Organisation. My question is about this lack of engagement and interest by the public in climate change rapidly, I think it was mentioned. And so rather than trying to push water uphill, should we, this is my question, should we be reframing the debate from one of climate change and all the challenges that we've been hearing about how you communicate that, to one of communicating more around what people can relate to, which is cost, lifestyle, a low-carbon world that is efficient, quiet, more healthy, all of those kind of things where you can make a very strong argument that would come with a low-carbon world. We should be framing the argument much more, the engagement, much more in that perspective, rather than always talking about doom and gloom and technical issues around climate change.
And can I ask you, how would that, do you think, relate to the communication specifically around the negotiations?
Well, I think it's shifting it from a very complex climate issue, which as we hear, people don't engage with readily, to an issue of lifestyle. So what does it mean in terms of the way that their energy bill, what does it mean in terms of the way that they transport themselves around, what does it mean in terms of health benefits, air quality, all of these other issues that come very closely to the climate change debate but so I agree. I don't think actually public engagement around the actual Paris event itself. I think it's too late then if you're trying to engage people on that. What you should be doing is engaging people through governments, because governments will be what decide what comes out of Paris, and that needs to come on a long journey. So, but my very specific question is reframing it away from climate into lifestyle.
Thank you. And you're very welcome to make statements, to make questions, or indeed statements. Can I hear from you, please? Yes, please, yes.
Stand up, maybe you will hear me better. I'm Johanna Newman, I'm the president of the European Youth Forum. At the moment, we're trying to mobilize young people to really be active in Paris in a couple of weeks. And I'm a little bit sad to hear that the public should not be more engaged into Paris, because right now we are seeing that this is the only process where there is power, and we can somehow at least be a part of affecting and have our say. And I see a huge engagement among young people, because we feel it's an important question. Whatever poll you take up, young people care about climate change. But now it's a question about making it more accessible to us, so we feel that we can have a power in the process, but also maybe take down the language a little bit. As a climate scientist, I understand that it's complicated with climate change and the negotiations, but maybe this is not what should be stressed, how complicated the negotiations are. Maybe it should be a question about political opinions, and I'm really calling for this kind of approach, because at the moment it becomes too complicated and too scary.
Thank you very much. And I'll ask the panel to come back to these points as well. Please, introduce.
Yeah, I'm Bob Ward from the Grantham Research Institute. So I'm going to suggest that communication after Paris is by far the most important thing here. Communication, getting politicians to feel that they have the support of the public leading up to Paris is very important, but what will be most important is the way in which the outcome of Paris is communicated, because there's a very real danger of it being communicated as the end of something or a failure. We already know ambition's not going to be consistent with 2 degrees, and so it's really about that. And it has to be said that in past conferences there's been a real mistake made by all the governments and people involved in it, and they tend to collapse into exhaustion after the process, and it leaves a vacuum immediately afterwards when all the skeptics and opponents come out and they frame the view of what has been achieved, usually saying nothing. So it's absolutely essential, I think, that a lot of communication goes into explaining to the public how the world is different, what has been achieved, what will happen, and what goes on. And that needs to go on not just in the days and weeks afterwards, but months and years afterwards.
Thank you, Bob. I'll come back to the panel now, and actually, please, if you do draw, I'd like you especially to answer that one, because that seems to be a key one. We're talking about how to communicate Paris, but it seems sensible to anticipate how we might communicate afterwards. I know within the environmental community there was concern that after Copenhagen we got it wrong in terms of how we talked about the outcomes of Copenhagen. But also, please, also feel free to respond to the other 2 points. The point over there, Ruth, you might like to in particular reply to that. Who would like to start on this? We don't all have to speak, please.
Can I have a go? I'd like to pick up on the framing.
Yeah.
It's certainly true that as soon as you introduce the issue of public health and the climate implications of public health, particularly in nations like China and India at present, air quality, these are all issues that are very present, that people recognise, and that can be, if you like, coupled up with addressing the climate change issue. You have to be careful. People are very quick to sense if they're being tricked or manipulated by the way you tell the framing. So I think you have to be rather careful about that. But I'd like to just take it a bit further. It has been in many powerful people's or organisations' interest to constantly shift the focus of the debate onto the science, which is very complicated and a difficult story to tell. To the extent that, you know, if Antarctic sea ice expands a little bit, or the Antarctic ice sheet, a new result that says that, you know, there might be more snowfall going into it just at present than out of it, it's an immediate opportunity for the very simplistic argument to be put, oh, well, the science is wrong, we don't have to worry about it. But actually, this isn't an issue of science, and in the play and the book is on sale, by the way, I recommend you buy it. 2071, the world will leave our grandchildren, and that's the point, the world will leave our grandchildren. we're dealing with an ethical and moral issue, a value issue, and that's where the debate should be. Science can illuminate the decision making, but it's not for scientists to decide. It's for economists, politicians, ethicists, the faith communities. It's for people to decide what sort of a future do you want, what sort of a world do you want to create. And that's the issue that we have not forced politicians to confront because they keep slipping away from that. Let me give you an example. They talk a lot about discount rate, and the economists play with the discount rate constantly. They use that to attempt to trash the original Stern report. They said that the discount rate he chose was improper. They wish to discount the future more rapidly. And Nick Stern has come back and pointed out when you choose a discount rate, it's not a numerical value, it's not an economic value, it's an ethical value. It's a number, sorry, I should be using the word number. It's a value number. It's how much you care about the future. So I think that we've allowed the public discussion to constantly be shifted into the long grass of complex science, where people in the end kind of give up and go, well, I can't make head and tail of this, I don't know what's right or wrong. And so the debate that we really need is what sort of a future do we want to create? And after Paris, sorry, Freudian slip there, after Paris, that's the discussion that we should be having, because the agreements are one thing, but how they're implemented and whether they're implemented is another. That's where the pressure should be applied.
We just talk.
I just have to talk into it, that's relatively straightforward. I'll go back to just repeating what I said earlier. I said I thought it was absolutely vital for people to be engaged in the conversation around climate change. I said I didn't think that it was necessarily the best use of time and energy for people who were passionate campaigners to involve themselves in the intricacies of a UN negotiation. By which I mean, I guess, from my point of view, that it's fantastic if people turn up to Paris and they put pressure on their governments to do the right thing. But what I fear is that a vast amount of the time and energy of highly intelligent and motivated people within civil society is focused on the details of a negotiation and is not focused on the things that we're talking about here, which is actually how to engage people in a conversation at a much broader and more deep-seated level than can possibly happen within that technical process. And I think it's a reasonable thing to say that any negotiation of this kind ends up being the summation of the political will that you're capable of capturing from the national context in which you work. And those national contexts in the end are formed by our culture, our politics, how we work here on the ground. And if you look around us right now, we've not done the most fantastic job in the UK. I mean, I'm not sure, I don't know about anyone else's country, I know this one fairly well. We haven't done the most fantastic job in actually engaging a broader range of people in a conversation about climate change, why it's worth investing in the extra cost of greener technologies, and we have to do that better. And certainly from my point of view, this is, I'm glad to say, the very last UN conference that I will go to. And for what's left of my time, I'm much more inclined to spend it having conversations about how to engage people more broadly, because I know that when you then go to the next one in 5 years' time, the political conditions that you need in order to be able to get an outcome will have been substantially increased by the efforts that people put in on the ground. So I guess that would happen.
Chris, can I suggest the after Copenhagen, my impression again, the rest of you probably know even better, was that there was a narrative which went out of, right, faith sold us down the river, we've lost it, this is an abject failure. And I think that's maybe part of it all set up to Copenhagen, and then, it got the Bloom version. I have a sense now, or my impression is, again I'd like to hear from the rest of you, that there's actually a narrative that's already formed, which is there, almost regardless of the outcome, which is, well, we seem to be moving in the right direction. It's not as much as we would like. We have to raise the ambition, but we all seem to be moving in the right way. I just wonder if, on your experience of sitting and talking with people about the public, whether these are the right two narratives, or if either of these stand out, or indeed if we're missing something, there might be another way that we should be anticipating talking about the outcome.
Yeah, thanks. Because obviously I think the positivity that I'm seeing around the upcoming talks is by reframing the dangerous limits 3 degrees. So at least it's not 5 degrees, so whoopee. And I think that's a dangerous path to go down. If that's what it takes to maintain a successful story. So I think about the reframing is important. And this is what we're trying to get. Start with a position of values and all that. What's the number? And let's go for that. But that's the problem. If you just frame it in number, you can just change the number. If you frame it in terms of values, what future you want, we can't just upend that and say, well, guess what? We're going to have a different future now. That's a much harder thing to do. So that's where we really need to get into. So I agree, with that. But we mustn't. And Professor Candice, I think one of the problems that always stuck in my mind is the Department of Energy and Climate Change have a thing where you can choose the energy pathway to 2050 and how much nuclear, how much renewables, etc., etc. And you have the world comes up in 2050 with have fewer planes in it or windmills, blah blah blah. It's a completely unimpacted world. It's still lovely, birds chirping in the trees, etc. The rivers flow as normal, houses aren't flooded. And I'm just thinking, well, there is unfortunately still mustn't ignore the fact that the world is not going to be the same in 2050 as it is now. So there will be all these benefits, but it's not going to be a utopia. I think that moment's gone. So it's just finding a way of recognising that, bringing that into the conversation, which isn't disempowering for people, that doesn't just generates that. This whole the impacts debate is missing, and we've got to find a way of talking about that really, works with people.
Thanks, Chris. I completely agree with what's already been said. Just going back to the points of framing and Bob, yours about messaging after Paris. I think we haven't really mentioned or discussed sort of the issue of connecting the dots. So the public may hear about this international agreement on climate change that is going to be reached supposedly in December, but no one really knows what that actually means for them. And so your question about, or your comment about lifestyles, I completely agree with that. And a lot of the research I've done has actually shown that sometimes you shouldn't even talk about climate change. And a lot of people, even my family, my friends, I couldn't drag them to this event this evening because they'll just come up with the same comments that we discussed a number of times. And the framing of it is quite a clever way of engaging with people and connecting them to the issue. So what does a 2-degree future look like? It's great, a lot of people tell me, more Mediterranean weather, brilliant, what's wrong with that? So what does that actually mean to live under those circumstances? And what does it actually mean beyond changing your light bulb, beyond having a 5p bag? What does it actually mean, and what do all of those contributions lead to when it comes to this international agreement? And then you move on to the question of, well, if we're doing our bit in the UK, what about other countries like China and India? Those are the most common arguments that I face in the discussions I have. So I think that's definitely a key point we need to address. And in terms of framing after Paris, Bob has done so much work around this, and I think one of, we talk about a positive frame, I think we need an encouraging frame, and I think, NGOs, the media, the public, negotiators have a really important role to play coming at the negotiations, even if it won't be the ideal, it won't be absolutely what we want, but we need to highlight and celebrate the successes of bringing these almost 200 countries around the table to agree, come up with an agreement. It's a phenomenal task, and Ruth, you and I have been in this discussion with some of the negotiators, and I don't know how anything gets done, but it does get done. So I think it's something we need to acknowledge more and communicate that to people, so that people realise it's a really difficult process, but we have achieved something.
Can I just add something to that? What I'm hopeful for in Paris is a qualitative change. That is, that after Paris we'll have an instrument where, when the nations meet again, as they will do, instead of arguing about how and whether they should be doing something, they'll be arguing about whether they're doing enough. And this happened with the Montreal Protocol and the issue of ozone hole. When the Montreal Protocol was first signed up to, the agreement, the levels of reduction were not sufficient to save the ozone hole. The science continued to evolve, it demonstrated that, and so there was an adaptive pathways approach, if you like. Once they got the instrument in place, it was possible then to meet together, not argue about whether they needed to do something, but talk about how high the volume knob needed to be turned. So that's the qualitative change that I hope we'll get in Paris, and that's all to the good. And then, if the INDCs are delivered, then with a bit of luck we'll be under 3 degrees, but long before we get to that, hopefully the volume knob will have been turned up, and I think that's the area where we can have hope. It may not happen, but that's where we can have hope.
Thank you. I'd like, if I may, I'm going to come back to, but I'm going to help to steer the conversation in a direction so we cover more of the ground with this, which is, I'd like to now put it back to you, but I'd like you to ask you, what does public participation, public engagement, what would it look like? We've heard quite a lot already about what the content might be, what the language might be, but what in practice are we hoping to get, and how might we reach people and get them involved? And I guess one of the things we've already heard, but there is a mass mobilisation which is happening all around the world to have lots of people on the streets, which I guess is another form of, boot leather, isn't it? We know that there'll be work in the media, we know that there'll be a lot of outreach, we know that there'll be a lot of things on the internet. But here's a challenge as well. These are strategies, organisations who do public engagement are always following the old strategies they used before. They're always sort of, maybe things have changed, maybe we need new ways of reaching people. And I guess the question and challenge is, well, if we were successfully engaging people, how would we do it and what would it look like? What would successful engagement look like? I see several people here. I'd like to start there, please, if I may, because I'm sure there'll be something interesting. And please introduce yourself.
I'm Paul Allen from the Centre for Alternative Technology Zero Carbon Britain project. One of the ways that I think is interesting to engage is to actually calculate what it would be like to live in a rapidly decarbonised Britain in terms of how we get around, how we heat the buildings, what we were wearing, what we would be eating, and then take that information to arts and creative practice writers, script writers, and let them create a narrative to take us there. When we did the first Zero Carbon Britain, the BBC playwright Sarah Woods created a play called Getting to Zero. Then she did another one following it called Getting to 4 Degrees, where she took what Kevin Anderson was saying. And let's take people there so they can see it's not, as Dunning-Pohl would say, eating the insects off the wall of a cave. It's actually, oh yeah, a cat actually.
He is a lizard.
We can actually sort out what a lot of the other problems as well to do with obesity, to do with bad diet, to do with air pollution. Let's take people there and let them live. Episode of EastEnders set in Zero Carbon Britain. In the run-up to Paris, let's commission scriptwriters and playwrights to take us there and let's see what it's like.
Thank you very much, Paul. I see lots of people. Please. No. Yes.
I'm Rose Fenton from Freeware Centre, which in fact is an international centre for literature, literacy and free expression, and we are hot traders in stories and storytelling and literature, and it's very much what we're trying to do, picking up on Paul's point. And actually, how do we get public engagement? We've had a really interesting experiment in a whole group of 14 and 15-year-olds over the last 18 months, where we've worked with writers going into a school, linking in with the geography department, because their A department is trying to get rid of climate change on its curriculum, has been some time ago, but actually through stories, through the imagination, through writing poems, and it was interesting, when we went in at the beginning, they said, well, what's it got to do with us, climate change? There was not this, why should we be worried about it? Isn't it all about polar bears? And sorry, we don't get it. But actually, by the end of the project, we had a very different story. They've been writing, they've been engaging with their peers in Poland, in Germany, Ireland, Australia, sharing, feeling a sense of participation, sharing stories, and they came together for a 3-day youth summit in Berlin, and they now have declared themselves as climate change warriors. Their slogan is "Stop the Silence." There's one guy who's now put his name forward, a 15-year-old, to join the Islington Youth Council. He says, I don't think people in councils recognise what's going on here. I want to be the voice around the environment and climate change. I could tell more stories, but interestingly, it was through that sense of empowering them, for them to tell their stories, them to write creatively, and then to engage with other young people. They have a sense of somehow being in control of the narrative and not listening to the experts of the older generation alone.
Thank you very much. I'll take one more over here, please. Yes.
I'm Tim Ruth from Muswell Hill, Friends of the Earth. Over many years, the other members of the group and I have been out on the street with various Friends of the Earth actions, and it's apparent that people trust Friends of the Earth, they like the organisation, but people lead very busy lives and they give you a little bit of their time, but only a very little bit. And I think if we're going to get sufficient weight behind us, we have to have actions that people can take part in civically without devoting a lot of their time, because it's only a very small minority who will devote more than a little bit of time. But if you can pick some enemies that people can relate to, who they can see may be receptive to having pressure put upon them, I think that's the best way that you can focus the limited amount of time that most people who will stop and talk to you are prepared to give to the issue.
Thank you. And I'll take one more and then we'll come back to the panel. So if you have any thoughts on this. Yes, please. Yes. Lady there.
Hi, I'll stand up as well. My name's Nicola Steve. Hi. I think all that people have to do is promise their votes. That's all that we need. Because the policies and these decisions, it's all very well people demonstrating and, you know, that's fine. But, you know, politicians, they're only going to do what they think will get them in power. You know, unless we've got a benevolent dictator, we're not going to get politicians making the great decisions which are needed for the long term on climate change. That's the bottom line. And as individuals, you know, I've worked in this space for a long time, but my friends, my relatives, they're not going to be getting up to speed with all these details. And I think what you were saying about images of the positive future that it could be, that's what we need. We need for people to see that yes, we've got a problem, but we've got solutions and we've done stuff already. And if they were just, if there was a wave of well-being behind, we could cultivate that behind the idea of climate change talks being a positive thing. Make them look positive. No one's talked about migration, about wars, about, you know, kids. People don't want to see kids dying on Greek shores. They don't want to see that sort of thing. If people could, if we saw those sort of things and said, look, these climate talks are great, you know, they're all going to help a better future, not just for us, but for other people, which will also affect us, will affect your kids, will affect your grandkids. But I think all that individuals really need to do is say that, be behind, that it's obvious that they will give their vote, because it's not enough having however many, we know this from lots of things, it's not enough having vocal, however many 100,000, it's however many million on the streets. You know, there's been quite a few of you might have seen the paper that's just been leaked from DEC the last few days about renewable energy. So is this government really going to sign up to a lot of green targets? We've got fantastic civil servants. Are we really going to get it? Not unless they think that that is what's going to keep them in power.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed. I'd like to go back to a panel, and if I could start with Dr. Candice Howarth and go, Chris, I'll come to you last as you can wrap up, so to Prof. Chris second. If you have any responses to that, any finishing comments you'd like to make in terms of this question of what would engagement and participation look like?
I think we've had some really fascinating ideas. You know, I remember when I was in DEC, I think free word engaged with us a little bit, and it's something that, you know, ministers love. And I think the development of these stories and narratives, by getting people to engage in the process and create those stories themselves, commits them to the process. They feel part of it, they feel like they own it to some extent, and they feel a sense of obligation. I just wanted to share a couple of things that I experienced when I was in government, which I myself wasn't aware of in terms of what I could do as an ordinary citizen. So by show of hands, how many of you in the room know who your local MP is? Great. And how many of you have actually written to your MP? How many have written on climate change? Good, that's great. It's more, better show of hands than
Someone represents
well, I'll give you sort of the behind-the-scene perspective of that. So when I was in DEC, if someone writes to a minister about climate change, whether it's demanding what the government is doing, what the local areas doing on climate change, a response has to take place. They have to respond. And I many times was consulted and say, right, well, we're writing this response, can you input into it? So when you've got, as everyone else, we're all incredibly busy, when you've already got 100 things that you're delayed on already and a lot of pressing issues, this is something else on your to-do list. Now, when you have 100 people emailing the same MP about something, it will come to a government department or to an office, and I've been many times in the office, someone comes up to me, oh my goodness, we have to write 100 separate responses because someone's just mobilised all of these people and all of a sudden they want answers, which is fantastic. And another example which I thought was really amazing, it was about 18 months ago, and an international online NGO, who I won't name, which I'm sure you can guess who they are, decided to mobilise a lot of their members. They had a petition, and what they said was sign this petition, but then here's a template email. Email the Prime Minister about this. We want to crash their system. What happened though is they gave the wrong email address. They gave the Secretary of State for Department of Energy and Climate Change's email address. So I get this phone call about 10 a.m. in the morning saying, do you know anything about all these emails? They've crashed all of our system and they're all addressed to the Prime Minister. So I say, yes, I know who these people are, I'll call them straight away. And they were able to make that change and people started emailing the PM. But the fact that they crashed Department of Energy and Climate Change was fantastic because it got it on the Secretary of State's agenda and the radar. And they realised, well, actually, if people are demanding answers to this, then there must be public will for us to act on it. So I think my message is we can't stop. Regardless, whatever the government decides to do on particular energy policy, we still need to keep going. We still need to encourage people to engage with government and crash their systems so that they pay attention and that they realise that the public is concerned. They may not want to be engaged in the negotiations, but they want to see better and bigger demonstration from government of action going on.
Thank you. And of course you forwarded all those emails to the Prime Minister's department as well.
There's another good example of that. If you recall, when the coalition was first in power, they tried very quickly to sell off the national forests, and 38 Degrees set up a website. Now, I can't quite remember the figures, but it was something like 50,000 people, I think, signed the petition, and 30,000 took the opportunity to send a letter to their, or an email to their MP, which, if you think of it, is a tiny fraction of the voting public, but it scared the living daylights out of them, and they did a quick U-turn. Keep an eye on them, though, they're still trying to find ways to do it. But nevertheless, it does show that we do live in a democracy, and that we have much more power than we realise. So I agree with that. I love Rose's story about the narratives. I think getting people engaged to tell their own narratives is an incredibly powerful way of clarifying their views, and the gentleman was saying that people don't have much time. But once you've clarified your own views, you then begin to naturally partition more time to things that you see as a priority. If I could just gently disagree with the gentleman who talked about finding an enemy, God help us, we don't need any more enemies in this discussion. We need collaboration. The only way we're going to get out of this is by working together. And remember, we are the enemy. How many carbon dioxide molecules are we generating now unwittingly by having the lights on, this microphone and so on? So you know, we're all embedded in this high carbon world, and we would wish it would be otherwise, but we all have to actually work together. So I rather rail against identifying in a simple black and white way somebody who you can think of as an enemy, because I think that's diversionary behaviour. I think going and acting against particular groups. Even I have to say I don't think much of Exxon, but acting against particular groups is not the answer. That's not going to solve the problem. And finally, I'd just like to say I don't watch Question Time very often, but I happened to be watching the night when Charlotte Church made her intervention about the current refugee crisis and the contribution of climate change as an element of that. Climate change is a threat multiplier, and the security services and others have been recognising this for a long time. So just as you can't attribute any particular climatic extreme event to climate change or weather event, nevertheless you can look at the probabilities. So just very quickly, a succession of severe droughts in the Fertile Crescent, where agriculture first started, culminating the 2007 to 2010 drought in Syria, drove 1.5 million people off the land into the suburbs of Damascus and elsewhere, where they joined the 2 million people displaced by the Iraq War, which we could talk about a lot, but Chilcott would prefer we didn't. And that led to civil unrest, the repression, and the situation that we have now. So, so there's no question that the drought was a big player. Was the drought due to climate change? No. Was the probability of the drought greater, the 1 in 1,000-year drought, because of climate change? Yes. Apparently, it looks like it was 2 to 3 times more probable. And you see that sort of probability in all of the events, the extreme flooding that we've been having around the world, and so on. People don't know that. When Charlotte Church said that, there was, I don't know if you saw the programme, there was a dumb silence from all of the politicians and from Dimbleby, and they sort of all looked at each other and said, now what were we talking about? And then the next day she was eviscerated and ridiculed in the red top press, who are so ignorant that they did not know that she spoke the truth. So getting these messages out there, climate change isn't something that's going to happen to somebody else at some point in the future where we don't have to worry about it. We're feeling the effects now. Business know that, people don't. So going back to the core of our discussion, are the public well informed? No, they're not, and somehow we're not getting these messages across.
Thank you. Ruth.
It's been a very interesting conversation. So a whole gamut of different political perspectives on how you address this. One thing that sort of strikes me is that we're not being very honest about the fact that we know that we have a huge anxiety about the centralisation of power and about power disappearing into the hands of a very small number of people in national governments or a very small number of people negotiating at a place like the UN. Now, I personally think that those UN negotiations are absolutely essential, and whilst I do find them complex and difficult, I also think they're an astonishing human endeavour. But nonetheless, it does have to be said that if we are concerned about actually reaching out to a wider range of people and engaging people and giving them more power in the process as a whole, then the way to start doesn't seem to me to be to focus on the details of any set of negotiations, or even actually to focus on the details of a particular set of government policies at any given moment, or even arguably to focus at this moment on writing to your MP, though I know that that's a useful thing to do in certain circumstances, Candice. It does seem to me that the thing that we have to focus on is actually thinking about ways in which it's possible to take power into our own hands to affect the transition. And there are a whole load of ways in which we can potentially do that. Some of them involve the kind of high-level lobbying that we're talking about. But that is a very tiny fraction of the things that we could potentially do. And an overwhelming amount of our time and attention and resources as a movement is focused in that high-level lobbying, because we're simply used, as frankly, a quite well-educated set of people who know our way about the political system, to getting power by exercising it through lobbying, not getting power by exercising it through communicating with a much wider range of people and involving them in a much greater way to take control of their own lives. So if we think about what that might look like, for example, it might look like thinking about involving social enterprises and crowdsource funding to attract money to pay for the kinds of renewable energy and efficiency projects, which our government centrally is not going to pay for right now. But where it's quite possible, for example, that the government of Scotland might be prepared to pay that. Or it's quite possible that actually, an elected representative in Manchester might be interested in doing that. We have to get much more imaginative about the way that we talk about these things, but also much, much more politically imaginative about the way in which we engage them, because, and I include myself in this accusation, so forgive me for saying it, the people in this room are fundamentally representative of the problem of the climate movement, which is a group of people who are mostly highly educated, have time on their hands, a load of social capital, and are used to manipulating politics through direct lobbying, not used to having to go out and have tough conversations about what the world is going to look like under a low-carbon transition. And the final bit of the rant, which is actually an enthusiastic one, because I think we can do this, and I think it's amazing. Other people do it better in other countries. The INDC process, that kind of horrible acronym which describes the national climate plans, an element of that was about public consultation around the INDC. It was about working out how you actually did that transition in a way that was really good for people in developing cities, for example. And we chose not to do that in the UK. We've got a Climate Change Act and we've got a set of European policies, and we just rubber stamp them and send them in. Because we're fundamentally a top-down economy that doesn't really have democratic conversations with itself. How about the next time there's an INDC, we actually turn that into a consultative democratic process, and that involves people describing the kinds of life that they'd like to lead.
Thank you. Yeah, and very hard work here tonight. And what I saw in those workshops, what I heard in those workshops, just showed to me that those processes could work, and that we've made a mistake in keeping people out of this debate. We need to keep people in, bring them in, have these conversations. Without it, we're not going to progress. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Jamie, if you'd like to close down the session.
So, firstly, give a round of applause to the panel. I'm sure you agree with me that was a stimulating and interesting conversation. Lots of agreements, some differences with, in that conversation. But I suppose that's what this research was all about, and why we wanted this meeting is to try and get these conversations going. Climate change is not an ordinary campaign. We can't get one policy through and then say job done. We've got to move on and continue that fight. And that's only possible if the climate outreach is done if we can get the wider engagement of the rest of society. So we need new approaches, we need new policies that's going to work with that. And you can discuss that